I want to spend a few minutes on a test you're absolutely going to see over and over again, the absolute eosinophil count, or AEC. It's a fundamental one, so let's jump right in.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with why we even count these cells, define what an absolute count really is, look at the old-school manual method, then the modern way, and finally how to make sense of the results. Pretty straightforward.
So first things first, why do we even care about counting eosinophils? What are the clinical triggers that should make you, as a future doctor, think, I need to check the AEC?
Okay, so think of eosinophils as your body's special forces, right? They're called in for specific jobs. If you see their numbers spike, it's a huge clue. It's like a big red flag waving, telling you to look for things like allergic reactions, parasitic infections, especially worms, asthma, or even in some cases leukemia. The high AEC isn't the diagnosis itself, but man, it sure tells you where to start looking.
All right, let's get into what we're actually measuring here. And trust me, this is where a lot of students get tripped up. So let's make sure we get this crystal clear. So here's the key takeaway, the absolute most important thing to get. The EEC is not a percentage. You might see on a CBC report, 5% eosinophils. But 5% of what, right? Is it 5% of a really low white blood cell count or 5% of a super high one? It makes a huge difference. The absolute eosinophil count, the AEC, just gets rid of all that confusion. It tells you the real number of cells in one tiny microliter of blood. And that's the number you can actually use to make a clinical decision. Okay, so how do we actually do this? We're going to start with the classic way, the manual method. Now, you might not see this every day in a big modern lab, but for your practicals, oh yeah, you absolutely have to know how to do this with a Neubauer chamber. Understanding the basics here is key. So, this whole process is all about being meticulous. First, you take the blood and dilute it, a 1 in 20 dilution using something called Henkelmann's fluid. This stuff is pretty cool. It does two really important things. One, it blows up all the red blood cells so they don't get in your way. And two, it stains the eosinophils this really bright, easy-to-spot red color. Then you carefully load that mixture into the chamber and wait. You have to give the cells a few minutes to settle down onto the grid, otherwise your count will be totally off. Now, here's a detail you've got to remember because it's different from a regular white blood cell count. For a total WBC count, you usually just count the 4 corner squares, right? Not here. For the AEC, you have to count all 9 of the big squares on the grid, the whole thing. Okay, listen up, because this is a classic exam question. How do you avoid counting the same cell twice if it's sitting on a line? There's a rule, a convention. You count every cell inside the square plus any cell that's touching the top line or the right line. Any cell touching the bottom or left lines, you ignore it completely. It sounds simple, but this little rule is what makes your count accurate and repeatable. All right, so how do we get from a cell count to the final answer? It all comes down to this formula, and it makes perfect sense if you think about it. You start with N. That's the number of cells you just counted. You have to multiply that by 20, because remember, we diluted the blood. Then you divide by the volume you looked at. The area was 9 square millimeters, and the depth of the chamber is 0.1 millimeters. That's it.
But here's the beautiful part. You don't have to do all that division every single time. If you take all those constants, the dilution of 20, the area of 9, the depth of 0.1, and do the math, it simplifies down to one single number. A little magic number you just have to memorize for your exams, 22.2. So your actual calculation is super easy. It's just the number of cells you counted, N, times 22.2. Boom! That's your AEC. Okay, so the manual method is great. It teaches you the fundamentals, but let's be real. In the clinic, day-to-day, you're not going to be doing that. You're going to use the modern method, which is way faster and uses the data you're already getting from an automated complete blood count.
And you can see the difference right here. You've got the manual method on one side, it's more work, you're looking through a microscope, but you get to see the cells yourself. And then on the other side, you've got the modern formula. It's fast, it's automated, and it's just a quick calculation based on data you already have. This is what you'll see on basically every lab report today.
And check out how simple this formula is. It's just the total white blood cell count times the percentage of eosinophils from that same report divided by 100. That's it. You're just pulling 2 numbers straight from the CBC. Okay, let's make this real. Let's say a patient's report comes across your desk. The total WBC count is 7,300 cells per microliter, and the differential shows that 6% of those are eosinophils. So what do? We just plug them into the formula. 7,300 times 6, then divide by 100. And what do you get? 438 cells per microliter. That's our absolute eosinophil count. See? Super straightforward. All right, we've got our number, 438. But, so what? What does that number actually mean? This is where it all comes together. This is the most important part, turning that number into something that helps your patient. Think of this table as your go-to guide, your clinical cheat sheet. A normal count is somewhere in the range of 40 to 450. If you see a number less than 40, that's called eosinophilia, and it might make you think about things like Cushing's syndrome or even alcohol intoxication. But the big one, the one you'll see more often, is when the count goes above 500. That's eosinophilia, and that should immediately make your brain jump right back to where we started: allergies, parasites, asthma, and so on.
So, let's just quickly recap the big points here. 1. Eosinophilia count is the real number of cells, not a percentage. 2. For the manual method, remember that magic number, 22.2. 3. The modern formula is just WBC times the percent. And 4, and this is the most important for your clinical years, a count over 500, eosinophilia, is a big deal. It's a major clue you need to investigate. Get these 4 things down, and you've got this test mastered.
And that pretty much wraps up our explainer on the absolute eosinophil count. But I want to leave you with one final thought, a question to chew on. An elevated AEC gives you a huge hint. It points you in the right direction, but it's not the answer. It's just the first piece of the puzzle. So your job starts now. What's the next step?